Hi, my name is Adriana Ryan, owner and principal architect at Foreman Light Architects in Naples, Florida, and also the 2022 incoming Vice President of AIA Florida Southwest. Today, I am pleased in this edition of Coffee Talk to have join me Mr. Stephen Hruby, owner and principal architect at Architects Unlimited here in Naples, Florida. Stephen, how are you today, sir?
I am fine. What's bad about being here in Southwest Florida in December?
I was talking to some folks outside and they agree that there's not one thing to complain about. It is beautiful weather. So I'm really glad that you can participate in this series because I think that you're a uniquely interesting architect in a lot of ways. Obviously, we have a lot of talent in our area, but I think you're uniquely interesting in terms of how you've approached your profession because in addition to the complexities of being an architect, running an architectural firm, I know, that you've given a lot of emphasis on reaching out to the community, right? So involving the community into your architectural efforts and endeavors through your projects and then also through your volunteerism. So, my own kind of question is regarding the way that you get community involvement and buy-in. What do you perceive to be perhaps the three pillars of that process of design and architecture?
Well, let's start with community involvement. Okay, I think we as architects really, it's about people, it's about humanity, and it's about community. What we produce affects the population, affects people in many ways. With shelter, with how psychologically they feel. So getting whether it's an individual client or an entire community involved in the process and understanding the process is very important. When you talk about community involvement, that's a whole other aspect. A good portion of my practice has been a community revitalization in major metropolitan areas of the city, usually distressed neighborhoods. I don't know if there's three pillars, but let me talk to you a little bit about the process. You really need involvement of all stakeholders and a buy-in that they want to do something to revitalize a community, to improve a community. And I always say there's the big P and the small p. If you don't have the two politics behind you, so if your leadership in the city is not bought into it, it's not going to happen. Right. If your advocates and your community grassroots folks have another agenda and they are fighting it, it's not going to happen. It's about consensus building. And the way you're doing that is you really just need to dig down and dialogue with folks, get them to understand what the issues are, listen to them to find out what their issues are. You go into a community and it's their community. It's they belong, even if it's a poor, distressed neighborhood, there's ties, there's relationships, there's support systems within that community, and you just can't go in and fragment those and come in and say, here's my master plan, we're here to help you. No, you need to listen to them and incorporate what their issues are, whether it's needs, whether it's functionality, or whether it's just what they feel the essence of their community is about. Mm-hmm. So that's on the community involvement level. You talk about my involvement in the community at large. And I think that's more, I believe as an architect, we need to be out there. Sometimes we're our own worst promoters. We need to be promoting architecture and architects, what we do, how we do it, and what architecture is about and why it's important. And most the average person walking in the street doesn't really understand that. Mm-hmm. They think of Howard Roark and they think of egocentric architects. They don't understand what we do, how we do it, and how important it is. It impacts them every day, no matter where they walk, no matter where they go. Some architect, some designer, some planner has had their finger on creating that space, creating that environment. I'm about getting involved in the community to communicate who we are and to demonstrate as a professional what we do. You and I both sit on DRB together here in Naples, and you see how I behave in DRB. And I tell you, a good portion of the time I'm playing to the camera because it is on closed circuit television. So when we review something, so the public understands what we're talking about and why it's important and why these decisions that we're making to review a piece of architecture are important. So I really think that's our obligation as a professional to make people understand architecture and architects in a much more favorable and much more sensitive way.
Yeah. So I find that really interesting because the process that you're articulating is one that quite frankly has a breadth, depth, and scope that far exceeds anything we've ever learned in architecture school or graduate school or anything. You know, how do you get political buy-in? How do you get community buy-in? You know, all these different ways in which our skill sets need to be engaged outside of strictly the design aspect of what we do. So in that regard, considering, you know, as architects we design buildings, but we have skill sets that translate, like you say, to community boards, to, you know, understanding where communities are when you do that initial precedent research. So I'd be curious, you know, when you think about an architect at large, right, within the larger context of our society and throughout history, what do you consider the role of the architect to be, right? Or the most successful architects through history, what do you think their role has been?
I think it's changed, it's evolved. You know, there was a time when the architect was the orchestra leader. He controlled all of the skills, all of the sub-professions, and he was the controlling entity of a project. That's no longer true. Architecture planning technology has become so complex, and there's so many layers of different skill sets, very complex skill sets, that it becomes a team. And if you as an architect aren't a good team player, team manager, team participant, and moving from those roles, being able to move from the role of maybe being the team leader at times to being the subservient to another team leader, depending on what needs to be done, you're probably not serving your client or your city well. And maybe it comes from my planning background, but you know, in that whole community involvement background, you really do need to be sensitive to putting a good team together and having that team pull forward. I think so many architects feel that, you know, they need to have their signature on the architects, and they want to be the star architect. I've always said that the most rewarding projects for me is when either a community or my client starts talking about, well, I designed this and we designed this, and I'm in the background, and they don't say, well, my architects. No, they took possession of it. Whenever I could hear a client take ownership of a project, I sit back and go, I did my job, because what I did is I was able to implant a whole bunch of ideas and solutions in their head that they adopted themselves, and they will never perceive architecture or architect in the same way again, because they've had that experience. It's implanted.
Yeah, so that kind of common thread, I guess, of, you know, educating the public, educating the client, that's something you found to be pretty important in terms of your practice. Is that a skill set that you learned and developed over time, or did you kind of come right out of the gun, just like getting this because this is part of your personality? Maybe it was in the time that I came up in architecture school, because at that in the mid '60s, there was a whole trend on architects doing more than just architecture. Being in community involvement. One of my semesters was in an urban workshop maybe this is why I got involved in this, in a fairly distressed area of Johnstown, Pennsylvania, an old steel town. So you learned how to do that communication and that collaboration, because there was a team of us that were out there doing different things. So that might have been the impetus to start that, because I think the way we were educated in the 60s, 70s is a lot different than the education that students are getting now. They're much more focused on
on the design
Yes.
and using the 3D modeling and doing sculptural things. And yes, they're wonderful, but how relevant to what they're doing, how relevant to the community, how relevant to society at large. Yeah. So that's just my feeling as an architect. Maybe I'm oversimplifying, but I don't know how many young people I've told this to. Just because you're modeling it doesn't mean it can or should be built. Okay? It's wonderful that you can do all these things, and they're exciting, and but you need to step back and say, is it appropriate? Is it appropriate for the solution? Have I solved the problem? Is it going to create an environment and a space that is going to enhance a person's life? Meet their expectations, meet their needs, and maybe even inspire them and make them feel better than they did when they walked into the building. And I don't think young students coming out of college now think about those things. Okay, and I think they may have been forced into not thinking about those things, and that's really what makes timeless architecture. Whether it was built 100 years ago or 10 years ago, when you walk in, you feel something special about it. It still functions well. My wife and I started our firm in Manhattan. We're a New York firm, and we're based in New York. And we, in the early 90s, we moved out, marketed outside of the metropolitan area, the tri-state area. And we ended up doing work east of the Mississippi. When we started a branch office down here, very few people knew we were here. We were here mainly because we liked the environment. So we had 2 offices. It was great. You go to New York, come to Naples. It was wonderful. But most of our work was still in Dallas, in Atlanta, Memphis, Ohio. We woke up one morning and said, we have no projects in the tri-state area and no projects in Florida. They're all over the other place, but our offices are there. So I think we came into this in a very different way than maybe somebody says, I'm going to go to Naples and set up shop. But as we began to say, well, we need to be a part of this community, it was very difficult to break into, it's a small community, very difficult to break into the business structure here as an outsider coming in, particularly when we got down here as a New Yorker.
Yankees, you gotta watch out.
It wasn't so much a Yankee, but you're bringing down these high density, big ideas. And it took a while for folks to understand that, we were about, solving community problems. So a good portion of our work down here has been really more conventional architecture and residential, commercial, but we approach it the same way we approach a major downtown revitalization, with the same sort of involvement with the client and getting out the information that we need to solve the problem. So I think we backed into this in a different way than like I say, a young person trying to start a firm here. You started your firm here because you grew up here. This is hometown for you. So I think we both had a very different situation. If somebody's coming from Tampa to start a firm down here, it's probably going to be a little bit tough for them to do that. But that's true in any city. In Manhattan, students work for the big firm, they get the experience, and they get one little project, and they move out, and that leads to another. And so some of the big firms in New York happen that way. They were spawned off by architects within the city. Right. Rothmy Siegel created so many firms in New York.
That's true. So I'm really curious, what I find most personally interesting about architecture and architects is, I perceive kind of what you were talking about earlier. You as an architect had to be successful at talking to politicians. You had to be successful at organizing communities. You had to be successful at, managing budgets and time. And then on top of that, you have to be a great problem solver. So from my experience, starting my firm, I'm in the process now of continuing from graduate school, developing a process, right? A process of thinking that I can apply no matter if it's a design problem or a practice problem or a personnel, whatever it is. So I'm curious, have you done that? Did you establish kind of just a basic process of design thinking that you were able to apply kind of across the board? And if so, what was that process?
Yeah, I think very early on, uh, my process evolved. Very early on. I think my planning school background it really helped. I'm a, you know, I don't sit down and start immediately drawing or immediately. I'm a pattern thinker versus a linear thinker. I will. Sometimes it's days, sometimes it's weeks. I just think things before anything goes on paper. I gather data, I get information, I look at all the mapping, I look at, I look for the patterns and for the nexuses and the connectivity between things and begin to filter out stuff that's static before I begin to solve the problem. And I guess, I can thank Washington University for that. They're the ones who taught me how to be a pattern thinker.
Yeah.
Because most architects, a lot of architects are taught to be linear thinkers. One thing follows the next. I solve this problem, then I do this one. And I don't know how many young architects I've run through my firm that were like that. They start and they go, and suddenly they get themselves in a big problem because they made the wrong decision at step two.
Yeah.
So I guess if I can summarize it, my whole thought process and my process of solving problems is pattern thinking, multiple pattern thinking rather than a linear thought process.
Are there buildings that you've designed or concepts for buildings that you've conceived that maybe haven't been designed that pull from the patterns you observe, not necessarily the structural patterns of the firm, but in terms of the design, like biomimicry, for example? Or have you observed the way that, maybe birds fly across? Oh, wouldn't that be a great way for circulation to work if we had maybe a sky bridge over here? Are there ways in which you have been able to pull your pattern thinking nature or intuition about architecture from just totally dissimilar places and then integrate them seamlessly into a way that helped bolster the architectural endeavor that you were working on? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And as you're talking, I can think of a recent example. Okay. We're doing a study in a real schematic design right now for sounds like a very strange idea, but it's a mid-rise, high-rise mausoleum. Okay, and one of the things that affects it, the way we're thinking, is how does the seasons and light, and what is the environment? A perfect example: this thing is possibly going to be located on a block in New York City, and in New York, the east-west streets. At spring and fall solstice, the sun rises and sets for about 3 days directly down each street. So if you're designing a building mid-block with an east-west slot between it, the sun shines through that
Nice.
3 days a week. Historically, when we did the research we were doing on funerary architecture, that sun angle, the solstice, is very important. It goes way, way back in history, that it has mystical and ephemeral thoughts about it. So that's a process that is beginning to shape my idea how this slabs of a building go together, and how light, and because basically mausoleum has no windows, it's slabs, and how light will play on this, and how it historically goes back thousands of years of history.
I think
So I think that's the first thing that came to mind.
Well, I think honestly, in terms of trying to educate the public about how architects think and why we think, that's almost a little peek behind, the curtain, because I don't think a lot of people understand that architects do think about the azimuth and altitude of the solar angle at different times of year, and where is that going to come into the building, and how and why. Is there, some way that we can capitalize on that to maximize the benefit for the spirit of the end users? And I think that gets lost in what we see in a lot of fast development. But is a critical part of what has made architectural endeavors so important throughout history.
Well, I think it's become more upfront and on our face because of the whole, environmental issues and environmental movement and LEED. They think LEED has made us look at things that we probably never did look at before. But anyhow, driving up 41, there's probably about 4 buildings that have totally misused sunshades. Yeah, they're using them as architectural embellishments. They're on the north side of the building. You do not put a sun. But then you get the south side of the building, there's sheer glass on the south side of the building. Well, we know, where's the sun shining from? It's shining from the south. How do you mitigate that? If you want glass, you need to protect it somehow. So the sun, you don't get the heat gain. So I think we're more aware of it, but I think a lot of architects have been using it in more as embellishment.
Right.
At times than analyzing and solving the problem with it. Capturing of rainwater, using of rainwater. How do you deal with drainage? I think that's more relevant to us here in Naples because we do have, on this coast and on the East Coast, sea rise and drainage issues are very, very serious. They can because flooding is a serious issue. So, I think we're moving in the right direction. But you and I both see when we're on DRB together. There are buildings that come through that climatically make no sense.
Yeah.
They may be beautiful, they're well decorated, they're well proportioned, they're contextual, they're neat, but from an environmental standpoint, they make no sense. And then you get some that are extremely sensitive in very simple ways have solved the problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this concept for me in which a work of architecture in a building is shaped, sculpted, its geometries, its fenestration efforts, the slope of the roof, are all dictated by the parameters set forth by the context and the site in which it's located, I think is a really important architectural pedagogy that our specific area of the country could engage to create a much more sophisticated architectural fabric. As you've acknowledged, and I've also acknowledged, we don't see this all the time. And a lot of times we see the opposite. And as 2 people vested in the community, I'd just be curious, what, if anything, can we do to help kind of promote this concept of, let's raise the bar of what we expect from our built environment. Let's raise the bar of what our community expects. Let's pay attention to the nuances of place and let's respond to it with brick and mortar. Is there a way that we can bolster this effort without being aggressively annoying about it?
For as much as I may have beat up on the younger generation coming out of school, there are hope. They get it. They understand. They understand that this is a serious problem. Climate change is, particularly in Florida, is a serious problem. And I think they get it much better than definitely a lot of my generation and maybe even your generation. So my hope is that as the younger people move into taking leadership roles in our organizations and in the profession, that they're going to start having that impact. I think it will evolve. Change comes slow, and also it's wonderful to say we want to let the climate and everything control how we site, but that isn't always possible. When you have a street grid that runs where everything is north-south oriented on the buildings, and your buildings face south, and you're on the street, how do you handle that? Well, you handle it maybe through technology, through better glazing, through how you handle the glazing, maybe you recess the glazing a little bit. So I think it's being aware of the problem and solving it within the context of where you're building the building in the most sensitive way. It isn't going to be a perfect science, but I think our technology is helping us on that. Just the efficiency of the air conditioning systems, the high efficiency glazing, better insulation in buildings, dealing with mold issues, dealing with all those. Those technologies are more mainstream now, and the costs are coming to the point where they're acceptable. When LEED started, when I first was the first LEED member, some of the stuff was expensive. You know, a 20-25% increase in the cost of. No, but the client didn't want to do that. But I think it's becoming more mainstream now. It's becoming more consumer. You know, consumers are starting to look for this stuff. I think we've had this discussion before. I think one other aspect is how our community is evolving here in Naples. Okay, and you just reminded me of this when we were on your little closing comment. It is evolving, and I've always said that when we first moved down here, first bought our first house here in the 80s, it was a sleepy little fishing village that was gone to seed, and everybody, they wanted to preserve just what was there. They wanted to make a historical relic out of it, and that's not what was appropriate. What was appropriate is it no longer served the needs of the industry that had made it originally. And it has now evolved into a tourist attraction, a very high-end residential area. And as generations change, as new people come in, there's different expectations, there's different needs, different aspirations, different trends. And we need, I don't think we want to be like Miami, but those trends from the little fishing village to the mid-century modern house to the Tuscan house to the little beach house that we have now to the transitional contemporary, that's a layering. And that makes, I've always said, the communities need to be diverse and layered. You look at the wonderful cities that everybody who, from Naples, who travel and covet to go to these European and foreign, why? Because they're so rich with the history and the culture and the changes over time. And I think, but you need to manage that. That's been my mantra on DRB, managing change. You'll allow change, but it has to be managed in a way that we're not protecting style, we're not protecting buildings, we're not trying to have historic monuments. What we're protecting is what's special about the city. And what's special about the city is its scale, its walkability, its wonderful landscaping, its steps from the beach. It has developed a nice, restaurant and nightlife that's very casual. Yeah. So I think that makes us a richer, more endearing place. And I think we, to keep up with the market, particularly younger generations, they're not fickle, but short. They're just short. I've experienced that. I don't need to. I'll go to look for something else. So you need to keep up with that changing trend because things change so fast. We also have an industry here that it's much easier and much more efficient and much more profitable to greenfield, to have a site. There's contractors, architects, real estate folks are not interested in preservation, renovation, modification, reuse, adaptive reuse. We bulldoze it and build new. If we build it, they'll come. If we charge more, they'll pay. So that mantra, it's very difficult to, it threatens. And I was just speaking with Elaine Reed from the Historic Society, and that's her passion to preserve these 52 historic cottages, and they're falling one at a time just because it seems more efficient to rip it down and build something new. So there are certain things that we should be preserving, and there are certain things that are really bulldozer bait. There's no reason, and we do not want to preserve some of this stuff. Okay.
Stephen, I'd like to thank you so much for joining me today for this edition of Coffee Talk. I'd also like to thank Badass Coffee here on 3rd Street for always being such a great place to come and work and relax. And lastly, but certainly not least, I'd like to thank AIA Florida Southwest for being a great organization to really facilitate this type of endeavor for our community.